We've been looking at the Olympics, and Nick started a few weeks ago with this reading from 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. And we spoke, didn't we, about the fact that we're at the Olympics. We're in the season of the Olympics. It's these 16 days where there's 10,000 athletes competing from 206 countries. It's an amazing event, isn't it? And there's over 339 events overall, with 33 different sports. So lots of different things going on. And some people get elation. They achieve things they didn't even dream of doing. You know, there was the 13-year-old who got a medal in, skateboarding. And she got a medal in skateboarding. And then you get people like the German heptathlete who gets given a horse that she doesn't get to choose. She's way ahead of everybody else. And then the horse refuses to jump. And she can't do anything. It's not her fault, but she's completely out of the medals because she's been given a horse that refuses to jump, and she had no say in that. So some people achieve things that they wouldn't even dream of, and some people that you expect to actually achieve everything, it just doesn't go right on the day. But today is the closing ceremony of the Olympics, and we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at the closing ceremony of a Christian's life later on, once I've done the preamble. So what have we talked about in this series? We've talked about the need for self-discipline and how important it is that we have self-discipline. You know, we have to commit to what we're doing. And Nick spoke about how Mo Farah averaged 20 miles of running a day. I can probably average 20 foot of running a day if I tried. 20 miles is well out of my depth. But that's the sort of a commitment you need if you're going to be an Olympian. And we have to focus on what is ahead of us and not look to what is behind us. You know, our sin has gone. We don't need to look behind us. But if we do, we need to see Christ on the cross instead of our sin. But as we look forward, we see the risen Christ before us. And that is what we're aiming for, to get to that point. And we're never finished. And Nick spoke about that not being finished and how there was this lobby. And we go into a hotel and there's different floors. And on each floor, as we move up from floor to floor, God will deal things with us. And we may have something that we dealt with on floor 1 come back to us when we're on floor 3, but we have to deal with it in a much greater depth. And then we spoke about that you've got to be moving ever forward. You've got to be getting better and better. And it's not a race or a competition against other people. It's us against ourselves. It's us against who we were last year, who we were yesterday. Are we further ahead? Are we further along than who we were yesterday? You know, we've already been given our crown. Our crown is salvation. But what we have to do is make sure that, we've got to make sure that we can express that to everybody else through joy and living in the satisfaction of serving God. We've got to train our Christian life. You know, we've got to be a disciple, not an admirer. We've got to get involved. We can't just say, you know what, we're all off to heaven. That's brilliant for me. I don't need to do anything else because God's done all the work. God's done all the work so that we don't have to focus on that. We don't have to strive for salvation. What we have to strive for is being a disciple and bringing that joy, bringing that knowledge to other people in the world so that they too can experience salvation. But we have to build habits, don't we? We've got to build habits so that when a bad thing happens, when we hit tough times, we don't have to then try and drag ourselves off the floor. We don't have to learn the habits that we're supposed to have. We can actually fall back on those habits and say, you know, this is tough, but I know that I can read my Bible. I know that I can pray. I know that I can worship God still, and that will bring me closer to God, rather than something knocks you and you go, I guess I'd better start doing this, because it's always harder to start something from ground zero when you're not feeling good than if you're on a roll and it's part of your life. We have to be intentional in our discipline, in our discipleship. We have to be intentional rather than do it when we feel like it. And then last week, Charlie spoke about the importance of teamwork. Yeah, no one person can do everything that the Lord requires to be done on this earth. And she read from 1 Corinthians 12, didn't she? Just as a body, though one, has many parts, all its many parts form one body. And so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jew, Gentile, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. And the interesting thing that I thought was really interesting that Charlie spoke about was Nehemiah, that it didn't matter what your status was, but when everybody was building the walls, rebuilding those walls, everybody got stuck in. And there was nobody there going, I am above this. I'm not going to get involved. No matter who they were. They were high priests. There was even Shalom, the son of the ruler of a district. He got involved. You know, it didn't matter what their status was. Nobody said, I'm too important to get involved with this. And that is a really important lesson for us as people. It doesn't matter who we are, who we think we are required by God to get stuck in and to do the work that God has given us. But now we get to the closing ceremony. So in the Olympics, there is a traditional order of things that go on. So the first is that you have the parade of flags. Then you have the parade of athletes, and they all come out. And this time, because they're not competing with each other, they all intermingle with each other and, you know, hang around with the friends that they've made through the competition. There's a final medal ceremony that is delivered, and it's usually for the marathon. And, you know, traditionally we can understand the importance of the marathon and the Olympics together, and that's why they use the marathon. And then there is a short piece where it's a handover to the new host country who will host the next Olympics. And they get to sort of like give a little bit of a preamble, a bit of a presentation about what their values are and who they are as a country. And then there is the final bit, which is the extinguishing of the Olympic flame, ready for the next Olympics. Now, Jesus talks about a Christian's closing ceremony, about, you know, what will heaven be like? What will it be like for a Christian? You know, and he speaks a lot about it in Matthew 25, and he gives us 3 examples. So he talks about the parable of the 10 virgins, that we have to be prepared and be ready for the return of Jesus. Because if we're not, we could be running around asking somebody else for their oil, when actually we should have got the oil ready. He talks about the parable of the bags of gold. You know, we've got to be faithful with what God has given us. It's important that when God gives the talents that we've been given from God, we're faithful. And, yeah, we want that phrase, don't we? Well done, good and faithful servant. And then he talks about the sheep and the goats, where we've got to be righteous, we've got to love and have had to help others. So there's a clear thing there, you know, of these are the things that we've got to make sure how we were in our life, so that when we get to the closing ceremony, this is what's important. And then John 14:6 says this as well. Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So we know that the way to salvation is Jesus. So to get to the closing ceremony, we have to have accepted salvation. And then at the closing ceremony, we have the bits that Matthew 25 describes. A little bit before what Jesus says in John 14:6, he says this in John 14:1-4. He says this, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." So what is Jesus telling us in those verses from John 14? Well, he's telling this. Heaven is a real place. It's not this fictitious, ethereal thing. It's a real place. God the Father dwells there. 19 times Jesus refers to how God the Father dwells in heaven. We know that Jesus the Son ascends there, and we know that he says here in John 14 verses 1-4 that he is going to take us there, and that there will be judgment, but there will also be joy, and there will also be rewards. So we know that there's going to be prizes in heaven. And what are those prizes? So Matthew 5 verse 12 says this, "Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So we know that when we get to heaven, we've got to rejoice and be glad, because there's a great reward for those that have accepted salvation. And then in Matthew 6 verses 19-21 he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So we know that we have to do stuff on earth that gives treasure in heaven. And we know what that stuff is because Matthew 25 gave us 3 parables that told us what is important. We know that we've got to be prepared and ready. We know we've got to be faithful to God, and we know that we've got to be righteous, and that we have to love and help others. And that's how we store up treasures in heaven. So that's what heaven is. But what is heaven not? So it's not inhabited by ghosts. There isn't this thing of ghosts coming back and talking to us after people have died. We don't become angels when we go to heaven. Okay, a lot of people, sometimes you might see people say that sort of thing. We don't become angels. Angels are a completely different thing to humans. Entry is not dependent on a balance of karma, where we weigh up the good and the bad of what we have done in our life. Entrance is through the salvation and dying of Jesus Christ on the cross. And it is not a revolving door for reincarnation as either someone else or something else, depending on how we have lived our life on earth. So it's not any of those things. You might hear people talk about that sort of thing. That's not what the Bible says. None of those things is what the Bible says heaven actually is. So what happens to earth when we all go to heaven? What actually happens? Now, people have been intrigued about this for a long time and trying to understand the book of Revelation, the closing ceremony, if you will, on life on earth, and what happens. Will Jesus return physically and reign on earth? Does he reign for a 1,000-year period called the millennium? When is that millennium? Have we had that millennium? Is it coming? Will we live in that millennium? Will Christians go through a 7-year period of tribulation or persecution? Or will that happen after Christians have left? When will the Antichrist appear? Or has that prophecy already been fulfilled? Has the Antichrist already been on the earth and we're now living in the millennium of whatever? All of these things. Other questions. Will the second coming of Christ occur at the same time and that believers meet Christ in the air, you know? Will Christians be raptured and other people left behind to go through things whilst we're all in heaven? And what does Israel have to do with all of this? Yeah, what does the nation of Israel have to do with regards to the rapture and the second coming of Christ and things? All of these things have been discussed, debated and talked about. And I'm not going to go through them now. What we're going to do is we're going to go through them over the next few weeks and talk through some of these. But just as a very brief thing, so you've got that primarily you have 4 different views of what's going to go on. And as I say, we'll talk about these over the next few weeks. And they've all been given really complicated, large names. So we've got dispensational premillennium, which is Christ's return and rapture, where Christ returns and takes all the Christians to heaven. They're separate events. We've got historical premillennium, where Christians endure the tribulation of 7 years worth of persecution. We've got amillennialism, which is there's no literal 1,000-year rule of Christ. And postmillennialism, where Christ returns after the millennium. There's a millennium and then Christ comes back. So they are different views. And people point to different things in the Bible to say, well, I believe this and it's true because of X. And somebody else goes, well, I believe this and it's true because of Y. So we'll talk about them. They all share some key points. So they all share that Jesus is going to come again for those who love him, for the Christians. Jesus calls on his followers to make sure that they're ready, and we saw that in one of the parables in Matthew 25. And the other thing is that no one knows the actual time that Jesus is going to come back. But there are differences between them, as I've said. The order of events that happen, we don't know when Jesus will return, and some events say one thing and some events say another thing. And some say Christians will suffer, and some say Christians will be taken before they suffer. So there's lots of different things in each of those different views of the closing ceremony. But for us, that's all theology, and it's all people thinking big things. The reality is a Christian's closing ceremony doesn't really matter about all that. Because all that we have to make sure is that we are prepared and ready, that we are faithful with what God has given us, and that we are righteous and love and help others, as Matthew 25 tells us when Jesus was asked to explain heaven. And we need to understand and we need to live that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. And that's what we need to remember for our closing ceremony.